At MagicCon Vegas in October 2024, Wizards of the Coast announced that next year, fully half of premier Magic the Gathering sets will be based on outside IP. Spider-Man, Final Fantasy, and Avatar: The Last Airbender will join Magic's own Aetherdrift, Tarkir Dragonstorm, and Edge of Eternities. This brings the total number of Universes Beyond collaborations with franchises owned by other companies to just over 20, since the first Universes Beyond product debuted in 2020. Universes Beyond might be Magic's most controversial strategy decision of all time, up there with the introduction of the Reserved List, which declared in 1996 that Wizards will never reprint a certain set of extremely desirable old Magic cards. Many popular online Magic personalities have strong opinions about how Universes Beyond is diluting Magic's identity and turning it into a Funko Pop commodity used only to sell other companies' characters and stories.
This breaks my heart because half of Magic the Gathering isn't Magic the Gathering anymore. It feels as if the world of Magic is disappearing, as if the game of Magic the Gathering isn't even Magic the Gathering anymore, but rather a game that is a collection of pop culture advertisements for other properties?
With Assassin's Creed, Final Fantasy, Marvel, and more as yet unrevealed shallow depths to plumb, who's to say what part of Magic's waning originality will be skipped over and ignored to make room for Tales from Arkham Asylum, or Magic the Gathering, a Star Wars story. Before Fortnite and Magic, all that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind.
At the same time, Universes Beyond has, by all accounts, been an absolute success for Wizards of the Coast and parent company Hasbro, leading to some of the most popular products of all time, in Lord of the Rings Tales from Middle-earth and the Warhammer 40k Commander decks, among others. Wizards of the Coast's other major property, Dungeons & Dragons, has suffered its own suite of controversy recently. I'm recording this video just in time to report that in late November 2024, Elon Musk posted a series of tweets criticizing Wizards for trashing Gary Gygax and the other creators of D&D in the foreword to the recent Making of D&D book by John Peterson. The accusation is that WotC has gone woke by distancing itself from the elements of early D&D now deemed problematic. Says Musk, nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to trash Gary Gygax and the geniuses who created Dungeons & Dragons. What the fuck is wrong with Hasbro and WotC? May they burn in hell. And then, how much is Hasbro? Hasbro stock surged in anticipation of an acquisition. I haven't read the recent Making of D&D book, but I've read a fair bit of John Peterson's work, and I saw him speak about the making of the game at Gen Con this year. Peterson is the world's eminent historian of D&D and role-playing games. If there's one thing he hasn't done, it's erase or diminish the work of Gary Gygax and the other geniuses who created D&D. In fact, the details of many of these contributions would now be obscure or totally lost if it weren't for Peterson's scrupulous research. And speaking of Gen Con, that's where Wizards premiered the new Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook and showcased a demo of their new virtual tabletop in development. This comes on the heels of the Game of the Year winning Baldur's Gate 3, set in D&D's Forgotten Realms, and coincides with an expansion of the historic partnership between D&D and LEGO, a rare collaboration between rivals, as the LEGO Group and Hasbro are two of the three largest toy companies in the world. These partnerships and crossovers have largely been well received, unlike the expansions of Universes Beyond. Far more controversial was Wizards' short-lived decision to revise the open game license that allows third-party publishers to utilize D&D's core rules for free in early 2023. The change would have charged royalties and given Hasbro the right to utilize third-party content without permission from or compensation for the publisher. Wizards retracted the announcement after a wave of community backlash. On the back of Magic and D&D, Wizards has become Hasbro's highest-earning division. No small feat considering that Hasbro's portfolio includes the likes of Transformers, Nerf, My Little Pony, G.I. Joe, Parker Brothers, Play-Doh, Power Rangers, and Peppa Pig. In 2021, Hasbro made Wizards one of its three highest-order company segments, along with consumer products and entertainment. The obvious category error reveals just how central Wizards has become to Hasbro's strategy. It's the only division of the company so important that they didn't want to mess with it in the reorg. In 2022, Wizards CEO Chris Cox rose to become CEO of all of Hasbro. If you read Hasbro's annual reports from the past several years, you'll notice a few things. First, Magic and D&D appear earlier and earlier each year, until in 2022 and 23, WotC is the first item covered in the year in review. This is despite the persistence of insecure reminder text informing Hasbro's shareholders that these are, in fact, very popular games played by tens of millions of people worldwide. Transformers and My Little Pony hardly require such insistence to excite investors, even if they don't actually make as much money. The strongest strategic theme you'll notice in the reports is Hasbro's brand blueprint, emphasizing that the company needs to move beyond simply making toys and games and become a brand company, with toys and games being simply one of many lifestyle ways for consumers to experience Hasbro stories. In the past 5 years, Hasbro has largely focused on expanding into other entertainment media that they can loop into this brand ecosystem. Hasbro bought E1 for $4 billion in 2019 to make movies and TV. In 2021, they doubled down on using it only for Hasbro brand media. But in 2023, they were forced to sell it for just shy of $400 million, marking a 90% loss on the asset over just 4 years. These failures in the entertainment segment largely explain Hasbro's poor stock performance despite the spectacular growth of Magic and D&D. They've also expanded their digital gaming capabilities, launching Magic Arena in 2019, acquiring D&D Beyond to develop this new virtual tabletop in 2022, and releasing Monopoly Go in 2023. In his essay, What is an Entertainment Company in 2021 and Why Does the Answer Matter?, Matthew Ball writes that, at its core, an entertainment business does only 3 things. 1, create and tell stories. 2, build love for those stories. And 3, monetize that love. In this light, the recent franchise expansions of D&D and Magic actually look like they're going in opposite directions. D&D has deployed more and more D&D branded products and experiences in other media, such as the D&D movie, Baldur's Gate 3, D&D Legos, and D&D DLCs in a number of other video games. Magic, on the other hand, has increasingly brought outside brands into its own game through its Universes Beyond sub-brand, making sets based on Lord of the Rings, Warhammer 40k, Assassin's Creed, and now Marvel, Final Fantasy, and SpongeBob. I see Magic and D&D as fundamentally similar games in several ways, the least of which is that they're the 2 most successful games produced by WotC, and the twin reasons that it's the highest earning and most profitable division of Hasbro. The deeper likenesses between these games have less to do with revenue, profit, and ownership, and more to do with system, story, and genre. Both of these games are generic, in the sense of genre-ic. They're both designed to represent a certain genre, principally fantasy. And more than that, they contain many different fantasies. Exactly what fantasy means as a genre is a topic for a future video. But suffice to say there's a network of interrelated tropes and aesthetics that define the genre, and that D&D and Magic both exhibit many of them. In both games, you can fight goblins and orcs, demons and devils, vampires and werewolves, terrible eldritch gods, and of course, dragons. D&D lets you fight monsters of many kinds on many different planes of existence, and theoretically lets you put whatever you want into your own fantasy world. Magic is more limiting in the sense that you can't just create your own card in the same way you can homebrew a monster or a magic item. But the core engine that it utilizes to generate these different fantasies is the conceit of planeswalking. There's a multiverse in Magic of different planes that represent different fantasy settings. That act of representation is another thing that connects the games. They were both designed to represent fantasy tropes that have their origins in other media sources. In some cases, the games have even represented fantasy ideas that originated in the other. Both have grown impressive suites of native lore over the decades. Characters, creatures, settings, and conflicts unique to their own game worlds. But these original creations often play on or directly reference pre-existing ones. Dracula doesn't appear in either game, but each has its own iconic vampire patriarch. Both D&D and Magic are also the archetypes of their own kind of game, the role-playing game and the trading card game. Each was the first game in its category. There really might not be role-playing games today without D&D, nor trading card games without Magic. And each has come to define what its unique medium is capable of, at least in the popular imagination. And if we bring back the business side, Magic and D&D were both created at small independent game companies operated out of their founders' basements when their tentpole games were devised. Each catapulted its company to national success until it was later bought by a bigger, more successful toy and game company. And now, they find themselves the flagship brands of America's largest toy company and the world's third. So, why is Hasbro taking completely opposite approaches with these games as they try to develop them into lifestyle brands? Obviously, Hasbro wants to make money and to make more money each year than the previous year. Hasbro is a publicly traded company, and whether you think shareholder capitalism is good or bad or don't care, it's a fact of the world we live in, a premise of the system in which these games exist. Really, this premise of the bottom line hasn't changed since D&D and Magic were created. When Gary Gygax founded Tactical Studies Rules in 1973, he was only falteringly employed after nearly a year of total unemployment. He needed the extra cash from the rulebooks TSR sold, a couple sets of wargame mechanics, and eventually D&D in 1974, to put food on the table for his family of 5. And when Peter Atkinson commissioned Richard Garfield to design Magic the Gathering for Wizards of the Coast in 1992, he selected it over Garfield's other proposals because it could be produced more cheaply than a full board game with many different types of components. These are both games that were designed to be consumer products, although their creators and financiers surely couldn't have predicted just how much money consumers would eventually be willing to spend on them. And it's true, the incentives of their stewards changed when publicly traded Hasbro bought out their private owners. These incentives would change again if a private buyer such as Elon Musk took control of the company. But how easily could a different owner really improve the direction these games are headed? And of course, we have to remember that games are not just consumer products, and game designers surely don't do it because they're trying to make as much money as possible. Game design is a craft. Oftentimes, it's an art. It justifies itself without needing to appeal to the bottom line. Magic and D&D are especially interpretable as art media because both game systems scaffold elaborate narratives. They exist at the center of a swirl of rules and story. Both of these elements, the economics on the one hand and creative pursuit on the other, have guided these games' evolution and growth. So, what are the game systems of D&D and Magic doing? What makes them successful, and what exactly are they successful at? Where do they fit into the fantasy genre? And why, in the age of IP franchisation, is Hasbro using these brands the way they are? Hi, I'm Ben. I'm an avid player of Magic the Gathering and of Dungeons & Dragons, if that wasn't already obvious. And today, let's take a look at what characterizes D&D and Magic as game systems and as consumer goods, and how the elements of system, story, and genre dictate their roles as games and brands in the culture and in the marketplace.
Robert hath a swift hand, he doth gaze upon the field, and he makes...
First, let's define some terms. I'm going to make a distinction between stories and systems in a media experience. For the purposes of this video, a system is the apparatus by which we experience a media object, and a story is the experience conveyed by that media object. This distinction has been similarly represented with other word pairs: form and substance, structure and content, tool and subject, medium and message. These are all inter-overlapping ideas and address a similar duality in the elements of communication and experience. For our purposes today, I prefer system and story because I think the words represent the right qualities of the components that I want to hone in on. So let's take a look at what those components are. A system is the networked apparatus of information-bearing objects that interact to create a media experience. This includes physical objects, like a book, TV screen, or a speaker; digital objects, like a media file; abstract objects and knowledge, like language or genre conventions; spaces, like a movie theater or local game store; and the senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell, which allow us to perceive and interact with these things. Of course, at base, each of these objects exists in the medium of particles and their positions. Atoms representing bits on a hard drive, photons bouncing into your eyes from a movie screen, electrical impulses in your brain carrying all the abstractions that let you see these things as real. In the context of art and entertainment, a successful system is able to generate a novel, pleasurable, or impactful experience in its subject. Story, on the other hand, is the thing being represented by the system of information objects. It's the experience, taking place subjectively in your mind, of this networked apparatus of particles. When you read a book whose system is just words on a page, the characters and plot of the book are imagined in your mind as the story. As Jean-Louis Baudry writes of the true content of a film, the image will always be an image of something. It must result from a deliberate act of consciousness. If a movie contains a narrative that features people and spaces doing things, these characters, spaces, and conflicts exist only in our minds because the only thing the movie system actually generates is photons shooting into our eyeballs. Even systems that are not strictly narrative generate a story experience in the subject. When you play a game of chess, the events of the game form a story that you could remember or report when the game is over. Some games' stories will have more tension than others. We can define tension as the quality of a story that generates hopes and fears in its audience. You hope Marty McFly will be able to fix the timeline and travel back to the future. You fear he'll ruin the timeline and fade out of existence forever. The core tension of most games is, I hope I win, I fear I lose. When someone far better than you at chess checkmates you before you even knew what happened, the game didn't generate very much tension for you. Not only because you didn't have any plausible hope of winning to latch onto, but because you didn't understand what your opponent was doing well enough to anticipate, and therefore fear your defeat. Chutes and Ladders is a system. It's debatable whether it qualifies as a game, but it fails to create impactful stories beyond a certain age, because though its gameplay is dynamic, it's hard for it to generate tension, because literally everything that happens in the game is determined by random chance. A system falls somewhere on the spectrum between fixed and variable. A movie is a system. It's an apparatus designed to create an experience. A movie has a fairly fixed story experience. Everyone who watches the movie sees the same images on screen. It's not 100% consistent, though. Someone who watches a movie in an IMAX theater and someone who watches the same movie with Motion Smoothing Plus toggled on their 50-inch plasma TV do not have the same experience, because some variables in the system have changed. Plus, people are just wired differently from each other. A movie one person finds edge-of-your-seat gripping can be dull to another just because of differences in taste, expectations, or even mood. Objective and subjective system factors affect every media experience. There is no art in the world that is exactly the same for every person who encounters it. But linear, fixed media like books, movies, and songs are remarkably consistent across time, place, and audience. A game like Magic, on the other hand, has an extremely variable or inconsistent story. And I don't mean the War of the Spark or the Weatherlight Saga. What I mean is, every time you play Magic, the experience, and therefore the story of the game, is a little bit different. When you tell your friends about that time you inverted polarity a stunning reversal in a 3-player Commander game and swung for exactly lethal on the crackback, that's a story. It's the impact the experience has on you, formed from the tension of your hopes and fears of how the game might go. In a movie, the characters in the story are on the screen. But when you play a game, the character in the story is you, whether the game literally requires you to assume a character or not. Magic is a great game because it creates great experiences, meaning great stories with great tension. D&D's stories are also variable, to an even greater degree than Magic. The players and Dungeon Master arguably have a much greater impact on the play experience, or as we're calling it, the story, than the actual game pieces and rules. In D&D, the audience is a large piece of the system that creates the experience, unlike in a highly fixed medium like film or TV. So we have systems that convey stories, and stories that create impact or convey meaning. It's worth pointing out that ultimately the distinction is arbitrary. The medium is the message, as Marshall McLuhan famously observed. In our parlance, you could say, the system is the story. McLuhan is often quoted to make the point that media carry their own messages independent of their content, which is certainly part of what he means by it. He writes in Understanding Media that the message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. TV or social media or the printing press reorganize human society and thought independently of the particular content they produce. Researchers studying the Lascaux cave paintings failed to understand why the animals they depicted had so many extra limbs. That is, until they tried looking at them under firelight instead of electric lamp, and realized that as the fire flickered, the animals appeared not to have too many legs and heads, but to be in motion. They didn't consider that the kind of light source they used to view the cave paintings was a medium that determined the ultimate message of the art illuminated. But McLuhan's simple observation offers a deeper meaning that's often overlooked, from which the popular understanding is derived. There's a reason he says the medium is the message and not just the medium has a message. He explains in Understanding Media that the content of any medium is always another medium. The content of writing is speech, just as the written word is the content of print, and print is the content of the telegraph. In other words, it's media all the way down. Content is an illusion. When McLuhan then argues that any medium carries its own message, it's because there's just nowhere else message can come from when the only thing truly conveyed by a medium is another one. If we look at movies, the content of a movie is a moving image and an audio track. The moving image conveys the medium of sight, and sight conveys the medium of objects in space in relation to one another. Audio conveys the media of speech, music, and sound effects. Sound effects often contribute back to the medium of objects in space. Where do we go from here? McLuhan asks the same question, then just sort of shrugs his shoulders and moves on. If it is asked, what is the content of speech? It is necessary to say it is an actual process of thought which is in itself nonverbal. Speech conveys thought. Music conveys feelings or thoughts. Objects in space can convey many things, all of which must ultimately be represented in the medium of thought. Ultimately, all messages exist at the level of thought, conscious or unconscious, but they're shaped by the particular apparatus of media that give rise to them. In fact, they are shaped by nothing else. This is where the idea of medium becomes more abstract. Ultimately, a medium is just anything that conveys information. Everything a game system represents ultimately exists in our minds, and these representations are themselves media for further representations. What is the strength ability score you have written on your character sheet? It's writing that represents a number that represents the roll of dice plus some modifiers. The roll of dice represents a skewed normal distribution, which represents a set of results predictably higher than a normal distribution, which represents the central limit theorem, which represents that the distribution of means of samples of any measurements or numbers generated randomly and independently tend to converge to a certain distribution that we have named the normal distribution. In this case, the normal distribution represents the population distribution of the attribute of strength. That attribute represents a set of qualities, which represent the average of skill in many different activities. Skill in any one of these activities represents a combination of physical might, coordination, training, and talent, which themselves represent a combination of genetics, background, past and present environment, luck, and probably a bunch of other things. The fact that your character's attributes use a skewed normal distribution represents that your character is heroic, better than most people. The heroic stature of your character then itself represents a trope or convention that the protagonist of an adventure story be exceptional. This trope is an abstraction that represents the history of protagonists of stories in this genre having exceptional qualities over the past several thousand years of human storytelling. We could repeat this exercise for any medium or submedium of anything. Ultimately, they all represent many media, which represent many things about the world or the culture. What I want to draw your attention to is this line, where the literal elements of the game system give way to abstractions that build on other cultural and narrative constructions. This is basically where I draw the line between system and story. The system of the ability score is how you calculate it, how you drive a modifier from it, and when and how you apply it to the rolls of dice. The story of the ability score is all of that cultural and narrative baggage it carries that tells you that your character with a 20 strength score possesses heroic athletic abilities befitting a Conan-like barbarian or Arthurian knight. What stories do Magic and D&D represent? What are the critical story media, as opposed to system media, that they generate? I'll cite Matt Colville's video, What Are Dungeons For?, in which he talks about how different systems of rules create different styles of play, independently from the actual content of your campaign.
A style of play is the manner in which the rules of a game reinforce a certain theme, tone, or genre. That's your style of play. You have rules designed to evoke a genre, and that combination, rules plus genre, is your style of play. What is the game about? Genre. And how is it about it? Rules.
I could quibble that in our enlightened McLuhan-pilled understanding of medium, we can see that the what is more than just genre, and the how is more than just rules. But Matt points us in a useful direction. The what, The story of a game is all of the elements of narrative: setting, character, plot, genre, all the ones you learned in middle school. And, importantly, tension, which is the most critical element of your experience. The how, the system, generates certain whats. Without producing the narrative specificity of fixed systems like movies and TV, game systems like D&D and MtG mostly produce genre. The rules of D&D tell you a lot about what kind of world the game takes place in, what kind of character you can play, and what kind of conflicts you're likely to face, namely fighting monsters. There are a lot of things the game doesn't tell you. Who exactly are the characters? What do they want? Who or what is in their way, and why? How seriously does the world take itself? How seriously do the characters take themselves? What are the physical, emotional, and philosophical stakes of your campaign? These are all questions that the DM and the players have to answer at the table. The story that arises is born from the system of the rules and the players interacting. So in D&D, the core narrative elements are determined by the players, but the zone of options for these elements is still guided by the rules, and to some extent by the culture around the game. If we all listen to the same D&D podcasts, we're going to form similar ideas about what kinds of stories we can tell when we play. The DM designs the campaign setting, but the game determines what kind of setting you can make. The players create their characters, but the game determines what kinds of characters you can create. The DM and the players develop the campaign's conflict, but the game anticipates what kinds of conflicts you can face. Tabletop RPGs are more versatile systems than movies or video games, but they're not universal. They still determine a lot about the kinds of stories you can tell in them. In other words, they determine a lot about your story's genre. MtG has a similarly generic purpose. It represents specific named characters with specific game pieces to a degree that D&D doesn't. But ultimately, the story that its system creates has more to do with genre than character or plot. A game of MtG is supposed to be a duel between two planeswalkers, but the secondary world component of a game of MtG is rather thin. Players actually imagine themselves in a wizard duel with another planeswalker to about the same degree to which chess players actually imagine themselves commanding battling armies of pikemen, knights, bishops, and monarchs. Which is to say, they don't really. When I equip Lightning Greaves to my Phage the Untouchable and cast Doomblade to kill my opponent's only blocker before attacking for the win, I'm not really imagining Phage slipping on Hermes' shoes, shooting a beam of black energy at my opponent's henchman, the Fiend Hunter, then running really fast and tapping my opponent on the shoulder so they shrivel up and die. The game system doesn't generate enough feeling of location or space, or even who exactly my opponent and I are and why we're fighting, and what it means for us to summon creatures to our aid, who are really people, using the magical energy of lands of different types that are in our kingdoms. It doesn't really make any sense. In the MtG lore, these characters are supposed to exist on disparate planes and have no way of interacting with each other. But it doesn't break our immersion when we assemble a commander deck with cards and characters from across the entire multiverse. I always think of this immemorial bit from the Brainstorm Brewery podcast, where Jason Alt pokes fun at how little sense it makes for characters from different planes to be represented in a game of MtG together.
And how could those sets even work together? It's like, well, I'm from a plane where it's 1532 Germany and we got pitchforks, and what the fuck is that? Oh, it's a smuggler's copter. Would you like to crew this? And then it crashes because they don't understand arithmetic because they're farmers, and how they get a pilot a I think you can't have a creature from Innistrad block flying a fucking copter around. I don't get that.
We're not really imagining a secondary world on which the things represented on the cards exist together. Yes, the characters on the cards also have stories published in novels and online short stories, but these are not parts of the MtG game system and aren't experienced by most players. The legendary creatures and artifacts of MtG, and even the planes, make you feel like you're playing with characters from a fantasy story without actually generating the experience of what that story is. The experience of playing MtG, especially in a limited environment where all cards represent characters and events on the same plane, do more to evoke tone, theme, and setting than tell a specific secondary world story. In other words, playing MtG primarily evokes an experience of genre. Generally in MtG, this genre is heroic fantasy, but many planes represent elements of adjacent genres and settings as well. Innistrad is Gothic horror, Theros is Greek mythology, New Capenna is urban mafia. These sets tropes are media that convey genre, and those genres are media that convey narrative associations without actually conveying a full story like the ones from which those associations are born. The story of your game at the Magic Foundation's pre-release comes from the tension of gameplay, hoping you'll win and fearing you'll lose. But the tropes, characters, locations, and actions represented on the cards create enough experience of setting and genre to make you feel like the game takes place somewhere and represents something narratively in the secondary world, even if you don't care exactly what that is. So we've established that the story experiences of D&D's and Magic's game systems primarily operate not on the specific level of character or conflict, but on the more general level of tone and genre. This is potentially a problem for Wizards of the Coast, who seek to leverage D&D's and Magic's stories into multimedia brands. Let's take a look at exactly what generic representations these games generate and where they succeed and fail at being resonant. I think anyone would say that D&D's genre is fantasy. What exactly the fantasy genre is and includes is a topic I plan to spend a whole video discussing. But we can ask some basic questions about the elements of fantasy stories and worlds to determine where exactly D&D fits among them. What sets Game of Thrones, or Avatar: The Last Airbender, or Lord of the Rings apart from others in the genre? To start, they're different in the way that any story is different from any others. They have different characters, conflicts, settings, tones, and themes. But what makes their fantasy different from other fantasy? Each has its own world with its own map, with its own nations and peoples and political conflicts. Each has its own fantasy creatures that behave in their own strange ways. And of course, the hallmark of any fantasy world is its magic. Each has its own magic system, whose particularities inform the conflicts its characters face. What about D&D? Well, D&D doesn't exactly have its own world. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, the game's creators, had their own settings where they deployed D&D rules for the first time. Arneson's Blackmoor and Gygax's Greyhawk, a town in the more expansive upper Midwest fantasy map known as the Great Kingdom. Over time, D&D spawned a number of homegrown fantasy settings, the most famous of which today are probably the Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance. But the whole point of D&D is that its rules are agnostic about its fantasy world. Its creators were inspired by the likes of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, Poul Anderson's Three Hearts and Three Lions, Michael Moorcock's Elric Saga, and Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser tales, many of which are on the shelf behind me. But it wasn't intended to directly simulate any of these specific settings. One element of the D&D world's cosmology that is rather distinct is the alignment chart. You know the one, even if you've never played D&D. This chart, which says that every sentient being in the multiverse has an inherent nature that can be learned by magical means, absolutely informs elements of your campaign's setting and conflict. It's basically a mix of two philosophies of fantasy tensions. On the vertical axis, you have the Tolkien-esque idea that the core tension of fantasy stories ought to be the battle between good and evil. Unlike in the real world, where these are just ideas made up by humans, in a fantasy world, good and evil are forces of the universe in an eternal battle with one another. On the horizontal axis, you have the Moorcockian idea that good and evil are indeed human constructs, and that the more essential forces of multiversal struggle are actually law and chaos. As Moorcock writes in The Weird of the White Wolf, "Know you not that two forces govern the world, fighting an eternal battle?" Elric replied. "Law and chaos. The upholders of chaos state that in such a world as they rule, all things are possible. Opponents of chaos, those who ally themselves with the forces of law, say that without law, nothing material is possible. Some stand apart, believing that a balance between the two is the proper state of things." Law versus chaos is not a conflict between good versus evil, but a debate over wherein the good can be found. Those who stand apart are neutral on the alignment chart. Law and chaos actually show up in many of D&D's inspirations. In Poul Anderson's Three Hearts and Three Lions, published a year before Lord of the Rings, the good guys are the forces of law, and the bad guys are the forces of evil. Anderson writes that a perpetual struggle went on between primeval forces of law and chaos. Humans were the chief agents on Earth of law. Ranged against them was almost the whole middle world, which seemed to include realms like Faerie, Trollheim, and the Giants, an actual creation of chaos. Wars among men aided chaos. Under law, all men would live in peace and order, and that liberty which only law could give meaning. Actually, 3 Hearts and 3 Lions is where Moorcock got the idea, though he added the element of moral ambivalence between the two sides. In the Andersonian view, law is synonymous with good and chaos with evil. And though it's never articulated as explicitly, law and chaos are forces in Robert E. Howard's Conan stories as well. Conan the Barbarian is the ultimate chaotic good character, slicing through all the Gordian knots that make civilization so evil and cruel. As Howard writes in The Road of Kings, a poem written from Conan's perspective, "What do I know of cultured ways, the guilt, the craft, and the lie? I who was born in a naked land, and bred in the open sky. The subtle tongue, the sophist guile, they fail when the broadswords sing. Rush in and die, dogs. I was a man before I was a king." In Howard's view, chaos is synonymous with good, and law with evil. So you can see how the fantasy influences on D&D fill out every quadrant of the alignment chart, not just with characters, but with primeval forces of the fantasy cosmos. But by creating a cosmology that's a superset of the cosmologies of its influences, the D&D world's tension becomes less clear. All of a sudden, you can have conflicts between the lawful evil devils and the chaotic evil demons. You can have a conflict between the chaotic good elves and the lawful neutral dwarves. Good versus evil is probably still a theme of most D&D campaigns. But how often are law and chaos relevant forces? What about fantasy creatures? The monsters presented in the first monster manual aren't quite agnostic about setting. They assume you'll be able to encounter goblins or demons or, well, dragons. But it doesn't assume that you'll be able to encounter all of the creatures it lists. Again, it serves as a reference that ideally allows you to represent whatever monsters happen to be in your setting. The rules cover many different kinds of creatures, including many invented whole cloth or based on the thinnest reference to real-world mythology, so that you can pick and choose what your players face. D&D has also produced some of its own iconic creatures over the years. The Mind Flayer, the Demogorgon, Bullets, gelatinous cubes. Of course, these creatures are themselves drawn from some generic or mythological antecedent, or in the case of the gelatinous cube, well, Matt Colville put it best.
I remember someone saying the gelatinous cube was the only creature evolutionarily adapted to survive on graph paper.
The gelatinous cube is a perfect example of medium becoming message. And again, just because these creatures are in the monster manual doesn't mean they'll be core elements of your table's campaign and conflict. As for the fantasy species available to players, well, it certainly has the generic fantasy races: elves, dwarves, halflings, orcs, goblins, all of which are of course drawn from Tolkien's vivid realization of these wayward fairyland archetypes in myth and folklore. D&D also has its own suite of fantasy species, many of which are basically just take a cool monster or animal and make a humanoid version. Dragonborn is a dragon person, Tiefling is a devil person, Tabaxi is a cat person, Aarakocra is a bird person. You get the idea. Are any of these resonant? Dragonborn and Tiefling probably are, though they're both generic enough ideas that I think they skew closer to the category of generic fantasy archetypes represented in the game. After Baldur's Gate 3, I think it's safe to say that Githyanki are, for the first time, an iconic creature of D&D, at least in broader gaming culture, if not quite in pop culture overall. But paradoxically, the more iconic creatures and fantasy peoples D&D spawns, the more generic its setting becomes. For the DMs watching, I'm willing to bet some of you have had a problem like the one I'm about to describe. You roll up your own campaign setting. You've got a map, you've got an elf kingdom and a human kingdom at war, and some dwarves who live in the mountains, and orcs and goblins in the spooky forest, and even an Aarakocra roost somewhere in there. Your elves are not like humans, in psychology or in culture. Their civilization is inscrutable to the humans who you presume to be the protagonists of this world. You even have some dragonborn, but maybe inspired by Matt Colville's Dragon Knights. They're very rare, and they were all created a generation ago by the sorcerers of the previous king. This means they're fugitives, ostracized everywhere they go. All of the fantasy species are like this, with their own peculiarities and strange elements of culture, behavior, and history. You did this because, well, it was fun, but also because you wanted your setting to feel like it was yours. You wanted to do what Tolkien did, and imagine a rich world with its own strange verisimilitude. In his seminal 1947 essay On Fairy Stories, arguing for the value and worth of the genre that was not yet popularly called fantasy. Tolkien writes that, when the storymaker's art is good enough to produce literary belief, the storymaker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it, while you are, as it were, inside. The process of imagining something different but plausible in its own way is how you make the setting for a fantasy novel compelling. So you've come up with this whole world with a whole history and lore and realism, and you show it to your players and ask what kind of characters they want to play. You have one player who wants to play an elf. Great. That's one of your setting's two most prominent species. Another player wants to play a dragonborn. Even better. That means all that lore you wrote is going to come into play. Then one of your players looks at the player's handbook and says they want to be a tiefling. You have to think about it for a second, but sure. Why couldn't they be one of very few devil spawn who have landed on the material plane? As long as your player, like the dragonborn player, is okay with playing someone somewhat marginalized in this human and elf-centric society, they can knock themselves out. Then your final player goes to the D&D 5e Wikidot and asks if he can play a Warforged. Well, now you really have to think. That sort of magic technology doesn't exist in your setting as far as you've determined. But the option is in the wiki, and it's all about having fun anyway. So it seems sort of silly to say, actually, in my very real fantasy world that so far only exists in my head, those things don't exist and you don't get to have fun. So you relent and say that he's a traveler from some other continent where they figure out how to do that sort of thing. Fine. But when you get to your first session, things don't quite work out like you were hoping. First of all, your elf player isn't playing an elf. I mean, their character is literally an elf on their character sheet, but they're not playing as this inscrutable and strange alien race you imagined. They're just playing a human with pointy ears and resistance to being charmed. This is probably because the player is a human, and though you sent them that one-pager about the elf civilization they're from, they're not a professional actor, and it's hard to play a creature with a complex non-human psychology for 4 hours a week. Second, trying to be dutiful to all that hard lore work you did, getting ready for and getting excited about this campaign, you're hitting the Dragonborn and the Tiefling with the appropriate dose of fear and apprehension from the human and elf characters who live in these somewhat xenophobic kingdoms. You don't want to lay it on too thick, but based on the rules of the world you created, every new human's first reaction to these characters should probably be, what is this monster doing here? You better have a really good reason or I'm going to kick you out right now. And you don't even know where to start with the Warforged. No one it interacts with even has a schema to understand what it is. Pretty soon, no one at the table is having fun, because the characters everyone thought they made according to the rules in the book just don't fit very well into your setting. Now, I've sort of amalgamated a few different experiences I've had as a DM and as a player into this hyperbolized disaster scenario. But the point I'm trying to make is this. By giving players an a la carte menu of dozens of different fantasy races to play, and by giving each of these races a generic enough lore description that it will fit with most settings where those creatures exist, the game sets the expectation that any player should be able to pick any race and fit it into the DM's world just fine. Having the option to play with something necessarily invites people to do so. Again, the system is the story. Of course, if the DM is proactive about this issue, they can just tell the players up front that in their campaign, you can only play a human, an elf, and maybe a dwarf. And if you pick one of the second two, there's a bunch of extra limitations I'm going to place on how you can play the game based on the elves and dwarves I designed for my fantasy world. In fact, the very first edition of D&D did something really similar to this. Gary Gygax liked the idea that the game should be about humans picking through the ruins of fallen civilizations that had been populated by more ancient races like elves and dwarves. So he put a bunch of arbitrary limitations on what your character could do if you chose to play an elf or a dwarf. This sets the right expectations for how the players should engage with your setting, but how much fun is it? The players didn't come to D&D to be a boring old human. They have to be a boring human every day of their lives. They came to D&D because they want to be something crazy, like a Thry-Kreen or a Grung, or a Dragon Man or a magic android. There's no warning in the player's handbook that if you play one of the dragon people, every single NPC you encounter for the entire campaign will be apprehensive and frightened of you. That's because the designers of the game smartly don't want to put that lore restriction on every campaign setting created by every DM. And since the magic android is on this wiki, it has to be in the world, right? These are reasonable assumptions on the parts of the players. And what fun is it to tell your players they can't do the cool thing that it says they can do in the rules that they're really excited about? I learned pretty quickly as a DM that the best way to design your world to meet player expectations, especially new players when they read about their character options for the first time and get excited about all the cool things that they can do, is just to have it all. Basically, make your campaign world fantasy soup. Look at all the most popular D&D podcasts. The Adventure Zone, Dimension 20, Dungeons and Daddies, Critical Role. These largely take place in fantasy settings far more cosmopolitan than you would find in most popular fantasy novels. This is transparently a result of the game rules and larger system of D&D. Fantasy racism and tribalism exist in basically every fantasy novel with sentient non-human species in it. This is because fantasy authors are trying to be successful sub-creators, per Tolkien, and fear of the other and strong in-group attachments are one of those eternally human things that gives your secondary world verisimilitude and conflict. But these elements are often just a drag on the tone and tension of a D&D game. So even though D&D officially gives you a smorgasbord of fantasy species to play or not based on your particular setting, in practice I think it sets the expectation that every fantasy species is playable and normal. And this does, in fact, implicitly genericize the fantasy world that your game is set in. The D&D setting, in the popular imagination, and probably to some extent in your campaign, is fantasy soup. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. My point is certainly not, D&D would be better if fantasy racism was in the rules. My point is just that a lack of specificity from the game system about what the differences among fantasy creatures really are doesn't actually leave space for you to make them up. Rather, the broadness implicitly points to a very particular homogeneous secondary world. Now, as for D&D's magic, it definitely has its own bespoke magic system, as anyone knows who's had to learn how spell levels and spells prepared versus spells known and spell slots work. Gygax and Arneson didn't invent this system whole cloth, though. It's heavily inspired by the magic in Jack Vance's Dying Earth series, where wizards have to memorize complex formulae and invocations that constitute a spell. Once they cast it, their memory of the spell leaves their mind, and they have to memorize it again if they want to cast it a second time. Most spells are so mind-bogglingly complex that even a really smart wizard can only hold a few in his head at once. Quoting from The Dying Earth, Mizirian would seek through his books for spells to guard him through the unpredictable glades. They would be poignant, corrosive spells, of such a nature that 1 would daunt the brain of an ordinary man, and 2 render him mad. Mizirian, by dint of stringent exercise, could encompass 4 of the most formidable, or 6 of the lesser spells. Then, when it comes time for him to go on the adventure, we're told which spells he selects. Mizirian made a selection from his books, and with great effort forced 5 spells upon his brain. Fondal's Gyrator, Feligen's second hypnotic spell, the excellent prismatic spray, the charm of untiring nourishment, and the spell of the omnipotent sphere. You can already see how some of these spells were given form in D&D. Now, this creates a wonderful pulpy tension in the Dying Earth stories. You know, going into the adventure, that Mizirian only has 5 spells to deploy that he can only use once each before he forgets them. Whenever a character gets into danger and uses one of their spells, they handle the immediate threat and resolve that tension. But a secondary tension builds because you're thinking, oh my god, he only has 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 spells left. Vancian magic, as it came to be called, works perfectly for the kind of seat-of-your-pants pulp fantasy stories Vance was trying to tell. Now, why did Gygax and Arneson pick it to use as the basis of the magic system in D&D? I don't think it has anything to do with the reason it works so well in Vance's stories. It probably has more to do with the fact that most magic systems in the fantasy they were reading just weren't that hard. Fantasy author Brandon Sanderson makes a distinction between hard magic systems, in which the rules of magic are clear to the reader and the protagonist often use magic to solve problems, and soft magic systems, in which the rules of magic are mysterious and inscrutable, and the protagonists seldom use magic to solve problems. In most of the fantasy that inspired D&D, the rules of magic weren't clear to the reader, and often the main characters weren't even magic users themselves. Certainly, Tolkien's magic is inscrutable and mysterious, powerful, but largely unknowable to our heroes. Elric of Melniboné, that dark fantasy edgelord e-boy hero of Michael Moorcock's Elric saga, is a sorcerer, and we know he summons his powers from dark pacts with demons, gods, and elementals. But we never know exactly what the scope and scale of these powers is, It's a surprise exactly what forces Elric summons each time he calls upon his patrons. Elric would later become the archetype for the Warlock class, but early on, it's hard to see how the magic system of Melnibone might have affected D&Ds. And though evil sorcerers and dark magicians abound in Robert E. Howard's Conan stories and in Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser tales, their protagonists prefer sword to sorcery, hardly harnessing, let alone understanding, magical means to achieve their ends. So among the fantasy that inspired D&D, I think it's clear why Gygax and Arneson chose Vance. His stories were unique for their protagonist's aptitude with magic, and for the clean rules that magic's practice described. A hard magic system is a lot easier to systematize with game mechanics than a soft one. In D&D terms, Vance's system became the higher your intelligence score, the more spells you can memorize, and you have to re-memorize spells out of your spellbook after every long rest. Of course, they didn't just lift Vance's systems directly. They formalized the difficulty and power of spells in the spell levels system, and just a 6th level wizard in OD&D can learn more spells than even very powerful wizards in the Dying Earth. Spell memorization turned out to be pretty confusing for players. Why can I only cast each spell once? If I memorized a spell, I should be able to cast it as often as I want. If you hadn't read The Dying Earth, the strange idea that a memorized spell left your mind when you cast it just wasn't intuitive. Eventually, the system was replaced with spell slots and spells prepared. Now, spells could be used interchangeably as many times per day as you had slots available. Pretty quickly, the D&D spell system became its own beast, with its own bespoke intricacies and confusions. Nevertheless, it's very clearly suited to a game system, where players have limited resources and have to figure out how to manage them over the course of an encounter. Admittedly, it's kind of hard to make wizards a playable hero class in a game based on D&D's pulp fantasy inspirations. If you take something from the Fafhrd and Conan side, the heroes really aren't practicing enough sorcery themselves for a robust magic system to be worthwhile. But if you take from Lord of the Rings or Elric, sorcerers are so rare and powerful that the strictly martial characters just wouldn't be able to keep up. You have to take a system that is expansive in what magic can do, but strictly limited in how much of it any one character can affect. I think this movement toward a quantifiable and versatile magic system also genericizes D&D's magic. There's a whole content zone on YouTube of people doing builds of popular characters from other franchises in D&D, using D&D's spell system to represent the character's own magical abilities. You don't see anyone using Call of Cthulhu or Monster of the Week to do the same thing, and for good reason. Those systems facilitate the creation of characters that are specifically suited to their own genres and worlds. According to the Dungeon Master's Guide, D&D supposedly lets you play a game in any genre, with any level of magic. High fantasy horror, low fantasy wilderness survival, even sci-fi or steampunk. But though the rules can be tortured to scaffold those settings, these offerings reveal how generically limiting D&D's breadth actually is. So overall, can we really say that D&D has strong world, creature, and magic system identities? Does it have unique trappings of fantasy that distinguish its stories from the stories of other popular fantasy brands? On the margin, D&D has a few iconic creatures. But as D&D historian John Peterson writes in Playing at the World, the fantasy setting of Dungeons & Dragons is a generic setting, an amalgamation of various fantasy sources rather than the world of any particular author. Its construction was a taxonomic exercise, incorporating a superset of the elements that appear in the corpus of fantasy fiction, and, through a system of quantification, providing something of a grand unified theory of how all these entities compare to one another and might interact with one another. D&D's setting is not just broad and populated by generic elements. It is intended to be only and entirely generic. In fact, this genericism lies at the very heart of its appeal as a system. But this broadness also prevents D&D from staking out any of its own territory in the way that Avatar: The Last Airbender, or Percy Jackson, or needless to say, Harry Potter has. There are probably millions of kids every day firebending, or summoning a fire blast with their Hephaestus demigod powers, or casting Incendio on school blacktops around the world, more than a decade after each of these series' final entries. There might be some kids out there casting Fireball, but I doubt they're thinking of D&D when they do so. And, as it turns out, even Fireball, D&D's most iconic spell, isn't even original to D&D. Thanks to research by John Peterson, we now know that Gygax and Jeff Perrin borrowed the Fireball, with a space in the middle, as one of a wizard's signature spells from Leonard Patt's fantasy wargame rules when when they wrote the fantasy supplement to their D&D precursor wargame, Chainmail, in 1971. So D&D is trapped in a strange prison of its own creation. It needs to be generic if it wants to remain the default baseline for fantasy on which players can build whatever story they'd like. But doing so prevents it from generating strong, resonant stories of its own. What about Magic's genre? Many of Magic's planes strive to capture resonant fantasy archetypes in their design. On his Drive to Work podcast, Magic head designer Mark Rosewater makes a distinction between bottom-up and top-down design in Magic sets.
Let's say you are an artist and you want to figure out what you want to do. There are two different ways that you can approach it. So approach number way is you can have a subject matter. Like you can say, okay, I want to do this piece of art. What am I going to do it on? I want to do a piece of art on Nelson Mandela. Wow, how could I capture Nelson Mandela? I really would like to capture his face, and maybe I wanted some sort of three-dimensionality to it. Oh, you know what? Maybe I'll make a clay bust of Nelson Mandela. The second way is a tool-based thing, where you say, I'm going to make something. I feel like clay. I'm going to make something out of clay. Ooh, what can I make out of clay? Oh, maybe I'll make a bust of Nelson Mandela. There's a big difference between subject matter driving it versus your tools driving it. Fundamentally, that is the difference between top-down and bottom-up, is that top-down is subject matter-based. I want to capture this subject matter. Bottom-up is mechanical-based, is that there's some tool I want to make use of. How can I best make use of that tool?
In the parlance of this video, Mark is making a distinction between story-first design, top-down, and system-first design, bottom-up. Magic sets have moved away from bottom-up design and toward top-down design over time, and that's no surprise. It's a lot easier to design resonant cards when you're drawing on existing tropes. On a Drive to Work episode about resonance in design, Rosewater speaks to the utility of drawing on existing tropes and archetypes when designing a set.
As a designer, you are trying to evoke something out of your audience. Well, guess what? If they already have associations built in, resonance says, hey, work has happened before you. People have told stories before you. People might have made games before you. People have done things in which you are building upon.
He cites Innistrad a lot as an example of resonant top-down design.
The classic top-down set would be Innistrad. That we started from a place of saying, we want to capture tropes of the genre of gothic horror. We want, zombies and vampires and werewolves, and I wanted to scare you. And it's all about sort of building a design that maximizes that.
After Innistrad, the frequency and specificity of top-down sets increased markedly. Theros is the Greek mythology plane. Amonkhet is the Egyptian mythology plane. Kaldheim is the Norse mythology plane. Eldraine is the European fairy tales / Arthurian romances plane. Thunder Junction is the Western plane. Bloomburrow is the Twee animal fables plane. Duskmourn is the haunted house plane. In fact, if you look at new planes visited in the past 5 years, only one, Ikoria, was bottom-up. Every other new plane since 2019 has had a strong, trope-laden theme from the top down. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with this. I want to be able to play my 6-shooter card and my Mafia movie card and my Gingerbread Man card together. As Rosewater puts it,
sometimes people don't think of their audience's pre-existing mental state as a tool. I know some people are like, but you didn't earn that. Somebody else made awesome zombie movies and zombie shows and zombie comics and made them fall in love with zombies. You have to make them fall in love with zombies on your own way. I'm like, no. They fell in love with zombies. It's great. And so by using resonance, you were able to build off it.
And though Innistrad was the first Magic set for which top-down design was formally deployed, top-down has been with the game since the beginning. In the same episode of Drive to Work, Rosewater says that
when Richard made Magic, the very first incarnation of Magic was completely top-down. And if you look at Alpha, a lot of what Richard did was said, okay, I want to make evocative things. Let me figure out those evocative things, and I'll just design mechanics around what those are. Richard borrowed very liberally from a lot of fantasy sources. You could see influences of Dungeons & Dragons, of Tolkien, of Greek mythology, that there's a lot of places where he took monsters that meant something. And a lot of the reason Alpha was really popular was people had associations with a lot of what he was doing.
Wizards of the Coast didn't buy D&D until 1997. But in 1993, Richard Garfield was already lifting spells directly from the player's handbook, like Fireball, Counterspell, Lightning Bolt, and Animate Dead, and creatures from the monster manual, like the Hill and Stone Giants, the Northern Paladin, and many of the Goblin cards. Of course, much of the material is original or iterative on existing fantasy tropes. There was no Shivan Dragon or Sarah Angel or Baron Sengir outside of Magic, but the proper nouns are merely a magic skin wrapped around iconic fantasy tropes. Here's Magic Hall of Famer Luis Scott Vargas and fellow pro player Ben Sek talking about the resonance of Alpha on the Limited Resources podcast.
One of the biggest strengths of Alpha is the top-down design. This is what you would call them when you take the idea of something really sweet and then you make a card to try to capture that idea, that feeling, that moment.
You know that fantasy has all these tropes. We have dragons, we have, liches, we have wizards, unicorns. You want to see what's the way that they represent these ideas in card form.
It's like D&D with cards, and it's like for all the people who were into that kind of thing back then, it was just like, bam, this huge light bulb moment.
Alpha wasn't the only early set to deploy top-down story-first design either. Magic's second set, Arabian Nights, was directly designed based on stories from the classic cycle of Middle Eastern folktales, 1001 Nights. There is an Aladdin card. There is a King Solomon card, who, appropriate to his Arabian Nights tale, destroys Afrits and Genie, and whose flavor text quotes the Quran. Now, if Magic was doing a 1001 Nights set today, they'd name him King Hakiman, and the flavor text would be from a made-up scripture. And they'd probably give such an important figure a more relevant ability. But is it really implausible that they would do an ancient Arabia-inspired set that not so subtly referenced specific characters from the 1001 Nights? In recent years, Wizards has gotten extremely bold with how closely they'll reference a specific character, item, or moment from a non-Magic story on a Universes Within card. Cunning Coyote and Resilient Roadrunner, Diamond Pickaxe and Careening Minecart, Sleep with the Fishes, and An Offer You Can't Refuse. Some fans take special issue with these cards for straining so far toward IP that Magic doesn't have the rights to without actually just being Looney Tunes, Minecraft, or The Godfather. It feels like Hasbro is deploying these cards as a way to say to Warner Brothers, Microsoft, and Paramount, see, this is fun. Look how much money we could make together. I almost wish they could just get out of the uncanny valley and be the thing they're referencing, like in Arabian Nights. Magic's third expansion, Antiquities, was bottom-up, based around artifacts. And to be honest, it shows. This set does not have much in the way of resonant design. The fourth expansion, Legends, takes referencing D&D to a whole new level. The West Coast playtesters literally just designed Magic cards based on the characters in their D&D campaign. As a result, the set had awesome characters and great lore, and many of the characters spawned in Legends have gone on to become Magic fan favorites. Here's LSV talking about the resonance of Legends on Limited Resources.
So many of the cards from Legends, particularly the Legends themselves, but also cards like Alcor's Tomb, for example, come from just D&D campaigns of the designers. They're D&D characters and campaigns that have kind of influenced the Legends set, because it's like, hey, how do we make a bunch of legendary, adventurers? And it's like, well, I used to have, this barbarian named Casimir the Lone Wolf. Let's make him. And that kind of stuff is awesome.
So top-down design, or in our parlance, story-first design, has been with Magic since its inception. Magic has more specific story elements embedded in its gameplay than D&D, by virtue of the specificity of its game pieces. The most resonant of these story elements tend to be top-down, drawing on existing tropes and stories. But the hungry, expansive nature of its system means that over time it becomes broader and broader, filling in more generic niches, exploring new design space, and iterating on itself. In his 2022 article, The Big Picture, Morrow writes that Magic needs to evolve to live. I like to compare it to a shark that must always keep moving and is constantly hungry. The game's lifeblood, its essence, is tied to the fact that it's constantly iterating on itself. I honestly believe if we stopped innovating, if we stopped pushing boundaries and exploring what Magic can be, it would die. Its core identity is tied to the idea that the audience must keep exploring and discovering it. Magic is hungry for new cards, new settings, characters, and even genres to explore, from which it can generate resonant gameplay experiences. In this way, Magic is as generically expansive and encompassing as D&D over time. The individual cards and worlds might be more specific, but when you add all of them up, you get another version of fantasy soup. Again, I don't want to make it seem like this is a bad thing. Magic's generic expansiveness and constant iteration are what keep it alive. If there's a fantasy or speculative fiction niche to explore, Magic is going to get there eventually. This is baked into the larger system of commerce and play that Magic's game system holds up. And this brings us to our second major lens of analysis that will help us understand Magic's and D&D's directions as games and brands.
I know thou wantest me to stay. I cannot deny these maddening visions of me in Calais.
Hasbro's brand blueprint that sees toys and games as one spoke of the wheel that spins a multimedia empire is not unique. Every media company in the 21st century wants their stories to be so beloved that people will pay to experience them in as many systems as possible. This is what lifestyle brands are. This is what Disney does better than anyone else. This is the subtext behind the brand blueprint. A game company makes game systems. A movie company makes movie systems. These systems must constantly generate new, compelling story experiences to grow and stay relevant. A brand company leverages its stories to sell new systems, or in some cases, leverages its very successful system to sell new stories. As Matthew Ball writes in his 2019 article, Disney, IP, and Returns to Marginal Affinity, businesses based around storytelling franchises, rather than movies or media, excel based on an intangible sort of operating leverage. Because it doesn't actually cost more to make someone love your content more, but the value of this love is substantial, companies like Disney benefit from enormous returns to marginal affinity. And the more opportunities to exploit this love, and the better you are at doing so, the greater the leverage. Today, Disney leads on both. By returns to marginal affinity, Ball means that a little bit more love for your company's stories than for the competition's can provide massively disproportionate returns, as long as your company is prepared to capture value from that love by selling your stories in as many monetizable systems as possible. Increasing love for stories that you own doesn't cost anything, and can't actually even be bought. If your stories are resonant, they'll generate a lot of love. If your stories aren't, they won't. In the entertainment business, how much people will resonate with the stories you tell is hard to predict, and probably uncorrelated with how much money you spend to produce them. As legendary screenwriter Bill Goldman writes in Adventures in the Screen Trade, the single most important fact, perhaps, of the entire movie industry is nobody knows anything. By which he means no one really knows what will resonate with audiences and what won't. This sage advice applies not just to movies, but to any company who primarily engages in storytelling as a business. As Matthew Ball points out, a company like Disney has succeeded spectacularly both at generating strong love for their stories and at developing a massive network of systems with which to capture revenue from that love. Disney adults are adults so captivated by a certain set of stories, characters and their journeys, that their leisure time and leisure expenditure are defined by many systems which let them experience and re-experience that same set of stories. Disneyland is one of the most successful media systems of all time. It does a perfect job synergizing dependent stories that rely on existing brand love to be impactful with new ones that generate impact on their own terms, and can later be leaned on to monetize other systems. Rise of the Resistance is one of the best theme park rides of all time, because it combines several new and compelling experiences with the world and tension already familiar to, and likely beloved by, most riders. And after you're done, you can buy a Kylo Ren t-shirt, a largely dependent medium, branded merchandise, that lets consumers re-experience a story they already love in a new way. A game that has many different great stories is still just a game. Monopoly has been reskinned with every IP imaginable, but it's still fundamentally the same. I'm sure there are some people out there who like to collect every single version of Monopoly, but mostly people just get the one or two sets with the IP they care about, like The Simpsons, or My Little Pony, or The City of San Jose. A movie studio that makes new movies every year still just makes movies. But a story or a character that has a movie, a TV show, and a game, and a t-shirt, and an amusement park, and a Twitter profile, that is a brand. And Disney is the best at creating stories with that kind of monetizable love. But selling your stories in as many systems as possible is not the only way to be a brand company. Though it's not as common, you can also approach the issue from the other side, building a system that's so beloved that you can sell an unlimited number of stories within it. The best-in-class example of this kind of brand is Lego. The Lego Group is the highest earning and most profitable toy company in the world, beating out Bandai Namco, Hasbro, and Mattel, who take the second, third, and fourth spots on the podium. Unlike Mattel and Hasbro, which regularly buy smaller game and toy companies to collect ownership of as many brands as possible, the LEGO Group only owns one, itself, which is a system of building bricks that can be assembled in an infinite number of ways to represent an infinite number of things, allowing it to generate an infinite number of experiences and therefore stories. They literally call it the Lego system.
System? System? There isn't any system.
What in the world are you doing, Gottfried?
There isn't any system. The toys need an idea and a system built around it. I want to put system into play.
So you're trying to put Lego into a system?
The system of play was so popular that they managed to sell it to many countries. He decided not to resume the production of wooden toys and to only focus on the Lego system.
Notice how this video about the history of the company emphasizes how critical Lego's systemization was for making it into a successful brand. Lego fans will show up to buy new sets that represent many different things. Lego's most successful themes are those licensed from other IP holders. In other words, other stories told in the medium of Lego. But why do so many more fans buy the Lego Millennium Falcon than another massive Millennium Falcon display set made by Hasbro? They're both molded from the same ABS plastic. It's because these consumers are fans not just of Star Wars, but of the Lego system and the Lego experience. Part of the story experience of the Lego Millennium Falcon is the fact that it's Han Solo's ship from Star Wars. But that alone isn't compelling enough to get adults to shell out $850 for a giant display piece. The other part of the story experience comes from the Lego system, which generates its own story experience every time you build something with Lego bricks. Lego has some brand power from the story side as well. It regularly deploys new themes telling homegrown stories, most of which fizzle after a few years, but some of which are among their most popular. Ninjago is Lego's most successful original theme of all time, no doubt in part due to its prolific children's TV show.
Do that! Look what color I am! Wait a minute, I'm still black.
And undeniably awesome lore and style. But I think Ninjago also benefited from a lack of culturally dominant competition in the subgenre of ninja fantasy. Lego Blacktron never sold as well as Lego Star Wars, Lego Pirates never sold as well as Lego Pirates of the Caribbean, and Johnny Thunder from Lego Adventurers never sold as well as Lego Indiana Jones. But there just wasn't a ninja franchise with that level of existing brand love when Lego created Ninjago in 2011. Lego also has some brand power from the Lego Movie, released in 2014. Many assumed it would be a lifeless toy commercial, but it told a great story in an innovative animation style and spoke to the core story that people already loved about Lego. When you play with Lego as a kid, you mix and match characters from different themes and franchises with reckless abandon. You might have your Lego Batman pilot your Lego Millennium Falcon to Lego Mount Doom, where you've pilfered some of the pieces from the spaceship to make a Lego double-decker couch. Lego is a mixing bowl of different characters and worlds that can always be rebuilt to make something new and imaginative. So yes, the movie features IP brand crossovers.
What do you think? A spaceship is just going to appear out of the blue?
Are you kidding me? The same bit?
But these are now an integral part of the toy and part of why it's so beloved. Lego is not unique in being a system with brand power. Movies are a system that also is a brand. There are Star Wars fans and Fast and Furious fans, but there are also movie fans who like the experience created by movies, not just the particular story of the movies they like. Movies, and of particular importance to movie fans, the theater experience, is a media system that generates interest in itself through novel and pleasurable experiences. Literature fans read books not just for the stories, but because they take pleasure in original, well-crafted prose. The medium has its own message, and the system tells its own story, beyond the events literally represented in the text. The intersection of system mastery and story mastery is where great art and great entertainment are born. More people go see Star Wars movies than watch Star Wars TV shows or play Star Wars video games or read Star Wars novels or comics or buy Star Wars t-shirts. The synergy of movie brand, the system, and Star Wars brand, the story, is where you get maximum reach with the public. The difference is that no one company owns exclusive copyright on making movies the way the Lego Group does with the Lego system. If someone did, I bet movies would be a lot more profitable right now. Lego's last major design patent expired in 1978, leading to a number of marginal competitors like Mega Bloks entering the interlocking brick-building set market. But because of its parts quality, build quality and artistry, and certainly its excellent brand partnerships, Lego has managed to retain brand loyalty even after its bricks are no longer patent protected. But not all systems are as monetizable as Lego. We can see what kinds of systems are the most monetizable using the economics concept of public versus private goods. There are two characteristics that determine whether a good is private or public: rivalry and excludability. Rivalrous goods are goods for which one person consuming it prevents another from doing so. Most physical goods are rivalrous. Food, furniture, clothes, etc. can only be used by one consumer at a time because these goods are made of atoms and can only be in one place at once. You know, I thought the media theory section of this video was going to make me say the most ridiculous sentence of all time, because that's just what happens when you talk about media theory, but the economic theory section is already giving it a run for its money. Non-rivalrous goods, on the other hand, are goods for which one person consuming them does not prevent another person from doing so. Digital files fall into this category, as do things like the beach, or a movie theater, or a radio broadcast. Excludable goods are goods whose owner can practically exclude some consumers from accessing it. Basically, if it's possible to put a price on it, it's excludable. Non-excludable goods cannot be restricted to only those who pay for them. Music used to be extremely excludable. You had to buy a record, or a cassette, or a CD to listen to a song you liked. But in the digital age, any song is available to stream for free online. When you arrange these two categorizations into a 2x2 matrix, you get the four types of goods. The upper left quadrant is private goods, which are excludable and rivalrous. These are things that can clearly be owned by one person or entity. The upper right quadrant is often called club goods, which are excludable but non-rivalrous. The classic examples are, well, clubs, like country clubs, dance clubs, and movie theaters. They're non-rivalrous up to a very large capacity, but they are excludable, so you can get charged a fee at the door, or at the top of the month, to go consume the same good as everyone else there. In the digital age, any goods behind a paywall or with a subscription fee are in this category. Streaming services, software as a service, Patreon pages, these are all a digital form of club goods. The bottom left quadrant is rivalrous but non-excludable. These are often called common goods. Many natural resources are like this. A lake can be fished by anyone, but when one person catches a fish, no one else can catch that fish. And if everyone is fishing because there's no way to exclude anyone, the fish population can be decimated. This is called a tragedy of the commons, where everyone's use of something freely available ends up making it available for nobody. Many roads and highways have a problem like this. Everyone is free to use the roads, but everyone using them creates traffic and makes them much less useful for each user. The final quadrant is public goods, which are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. The classic example of this is public spaces like parks. Anyone is free to enter a park, and one person enjoying the park doesn't take away from someone else doing so. On the margin, too many people going to the park can make it overcrowded, but this isn't a problem as long as the government ensures there are enough public parks that everyone who wants to can go without them getting too full. Radio broadcasts are also public goods. Anyone with a receiver can pick up the signal, and one person getting the signal doesn't stop someone else from doing so. Many digital goods also fall into this category. Any web address that isn't behind a paywall is a public good. This YouTube video you're watching right now is a public good. No one can be excluded from watching it, and one person watching it doesn't take away from anyone else doing so. So these are our four quadrants. Excludable goods are generally easier to monetize than non-excludable goods, because you can charge a price for them. Public goods can be monetized too, for example with advertising. This tends to come up more with digital goods, but you can imagine a world where private entities sponsor public spaces in exchange for advertising being placed there. This video is a public good monetized through ads. Digital club goods can be real money printers. They're non-rivalrous not because they're literally experiences that can be had by multiple people in physical space at once, but because they're made of bits and the marginal cost to produce them is nearly zero. Of course, the fixed costs can still be quite high. A movie might cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make, but it costs only a couple cents for the provider to stream it to your laptop. In-game purchases in video games, on the other hand, are an example of club goods that have very low fixed costs and near zero marginal costs. A theme park is one of the most profitable media systems ever invented. They're generally thought of as club goods. Many people can enjoy them, but they charge a ticket price to enter. They're technically limited by physical capacity, but if you price the tickets high enough, you can prune the market until this isn't a problem. A movie generates far worse profit margins, but it is non-rivalrous, meaning one person experiencing it doesn't stop another from doing so. This means the story experience of a movie is infinitely reproducible, and therefore can be monetized over a larger number of consumers. Now that we've established the different kinds of public and private goods, let's take a look at where trading card games and role-playing games fall on this matrix. Trading card games fall clearly into the realm of private goods. Each card can only be owned by one person and must be purchased to be owned. There is an element of non-excludability created by proxies, but the Wizards Play Network and tournament system makes it so that if you want to play at an official event, you have to bring actual Magic cards. And this trickles down to the point where most players use mostly official Magic cards in their decks. The robust secondary market for Magic cards is a testament to players' desire to own and play with the real thing. Because the system of Magic, including the Wizards Play Network, tournaments, and collectability, has brand power, Magic is able to keep itself strongly excludable and therefore monetizable. Some of this recalls elements of how LEGO managed to keep itself excludable even after its patents expired. Role-playing games are a little more complicated. Are they rivalrous? Well, one playgroup isn't rivalrous up to a very small capacity, after which it becomes very rivalrous. A single DM can only run a game for so many people at once before the experience deteriorates. But the game itself can be played by any number of playgroups without it affecting the experience of the others. This is because the rule set of the game is just a set of ideas, which are never rivalrous. What about tools required to play the game? Dice are technically rivalrous. Polyhedral dice of the type required for D&D were extremely scarce when the game was created, used mostly in academic settings by mathematicians. Now, not so much. Anyone who wants to can get a set for a few bucks. Dice sets are also a homogeneous good. Some sets look prettier than others, some are bigger than others, some are made of different materials, but they all let you play the game just as well. And now there are free dice rolling tools online, which are certainly not rivalrous. Other tools for playing the game, like maps and minis, are optional and easily substitutable if you're willing to use your imagination, which I assume you are because you're playing a tabletop role-playing game. Now, are role-playing games excludable? This one is a little more complicated. Inherently, they're not. Rules are ideas which have no marginal cost to make copies of and don't exist in physical space. This is a recipe for non-excludability. There is a set of relevant copyright law here, intended to prevent games from being impossible to monetize. Rules cannot be copyrighted, because they're just a process. How would you copyright the idea of rolling a 20-sided die, adding a number, and comparing it to another number to decide if an action succeeds? Language, on the other hand, can be copyrighted. That means the specific words in their specific order describing the game's rules in books that Hasbro sells can be and are copyrighted. Copyright law is a mechanism for making otherwise non-excludable goods excludable. So yeah, no one can charge you money for rolling a die and imagining what happens next based on the result. But they can charge you money for their specific language describing when to roll a die, what to add to it, and what to compare it against. That doesn't have to stop you though. In high school, I would run a crude bastard version of Everyone is John in the back of my calculus class with the D20s our teacher gave out when we did well on tests. That happens to be a game whose rules are freely available online, but I'd never read them. I was improvising a system based on what I heard on the Everyone is John episode of the One Shot podcast. I'm sure there are people out there who do basically the same thing with D&D. They've never bought a single product from Hasbro. They listened to Critical Role or the Adventure Zone or Dimension 20, and they said, let's do that. Then they printed out a character sheet they found online, house ruled everything based on what they gleaned from the podcast, and just look it up whenever they come across a situation they don't know how to adjudicate at the table. RPG systems are just ideas, and they can be spread by word of mouth without any copyrighted written language. So inherently, tabletop RPGs are neither excludable nor rivalrous. They're public goods. Copyright law pushes them into the club goods category. In theory, they can charge for entry via the rulebook, and once you're in, you can consume as much as you'd like. But practically, D&D sits on the line between club goods and public goods. There's also the open game license to contend with, which makes a core set of D&D rules exempt from the copyright protections they would otherwise have. In 2000, Wizards of the Coast decided that the core D&D rules ought to remain a public good, so that the community could create more adventures and homebrew content, more story experiences, I promise we're coming back to that, to keep people invested in the system at low cost. But even this action was taken in response to the fact that Wizards couldn't sell enough adventures to make their development profitable. Their hope was that the game's commercial ecosystem would be sort of like Disneyland. Once you pay for entry via the core rules, you're going to want to buy a bunch of other stuff on the inside, like minis, spell cards, and in this case, adventure modules. But people just didn't need that many published adventures, and many DMs like to make their own adventures anyway. Adventures are so durable, meaning they continue being utiled to the consumer for a long time, and substitutable, meaning there are enough good adventures out there that it's unlikely you really want the exact one that Wizards of the Coast just published, that, like DICE, they approach the properties of non-rivalry while still technically being rivalrous. The OGL was great for increasing marginal affinity. An endless sea of third-party content is a great way to build love for your game and brand. The problem was that there just weren't that many ways for Wizards to capture returns from it. Realizing this, Wizards infamously tried revising the OGL in 2023 to charge royalties from third-party publishers and claim rights to sell and distribute third-party content. This initiative failed due to predictable community backlash. But even if the change had gone through, I don't think it would have done that much for D&D's bottom line. Yes, Wizards would have captured greater returns to marginal affinity, but hampering and pissing off third-party publishers is a great way to decrease the brand affinity you have in the first place. The new OGL would have given Wizards a bigger fraction of the pie, but the pie would have gotten a lot smaller. In fact, just announcing the change, though it was quickly retracted, seems to have done the damage already. Many third-party publishers simply walked away from D&D after this controversy. But with or without the OGL, Wizards is stuck with the problem of trying to monetize a very durable, near-public good. Though you have to pay a small entry fee to get in, once you're inside, everything is infinite and free. And a bunch of people just sneak in anyway. Try making money running a club like that. So Magic is basically a private good that feels a slight tug of non-excludability, and D&D is somewhere between a club good and a public good. There's a reason that Magic represents over $1 billion of WotC's $1.45 billion revenue in 2023. Hasbro's annual report doesn't break out D&D separately, probably because its numbers aren't that impressive. But in 2022, Forbes estimated that D&D made $100 to $150 million a year, an order of magnitude less than its younger but now much bigger brother Magic. Go figure, it's easier to make money selling a private good than a quasi-public one. So, now we finally understand Magic and D&D both as systems and as products. As I said at the beginning of this video, these are the two key elements of these branded games or game brands. The designers think of them as one, the executives think of them as the other, that we have to understand to start unwinding why these games are the way they are, and why Hasbro is taking them in very different directions in their attempt to compete with the likes of Disney and branded entertainment.
When poetry before, I could not look thee in the eye.
Let's start with D&D. D&D is a generic system, which means it lacks the story resonance necessary to successfully monetize its stories in other systems. But while its own system is extremely resonant, it's hard to monetize because it's right on the line between being a club good and a public good. To be honest, kind of a head scratcher from a brand perspective. Let's take a look at the media crossovers D&D has done and see if we can extrapolate the reasons for doing so. D&D has occasionally brought outside IP into its own game, like with the Rick and Morty box set in 2019, and notably with the series of Plane Shift supplements, which let you play D&D on a plane of the Magic the Gathering multiverse. The Rick and Morty one didn't really have any lasting impact as far as I can tell, but I've seen a lot of races and subclasses from Plane Shift show up in my regular D&D games. Most of my D&D friends probably don't know or care that Loxodons, Kor, Leonin, Vidalkin, and Aetherborn are from Magic and not D&D. Similarly, I have a friend who played a successful D&D campaign set on Theros without any of the players knowing it from Magic. The DM just liked the ancient Greece-inspired setting. I think the fact that these elements of Magic lore fall so seamlessly into D&D is another demonstration of just how generic they both are. But it makes sense that a game system striving to be as broad as possible with options for player species would snap up those available from the other game its owner produces. D&D's more interesting and impactful brand decisions, though, have been to take it multimedia. The bullet in the room is the game's notorious list of failed TV and film adaptations. The whole point of the game, of course, is that you get to make your own character and be in the story. It's hard to capture this feeling in a fixed medium like a movie, where the characters are written for you. When you take the players out of D&D, all you're left with is genre, and no one wants to see a purely generic fantasy adventure. The 2023 movie, Honor Among Thieves, was pretty good, but I challenge you to name a character from it. I can tell you what classes they were. Chris Pine was the bard, Michelle Rodriguez was the barbarian, Justice Smith was the sorcerer. But I can't tell you their names. The movie version took the abstract archetypes presented in the game rules and concretized them into characters. Basically, it did everything it could to turn the generic story of the game system into a specific story in the movie, but it didn't manage to reverse engineer a story with a lasting cultural impact. I doubt we'll see a sequel, but I bet this would-be franchise would falter after a few movies anyway, just because you can only rehash the generic class tropes so many times in a fixed medium like film. What about the movie's representation of other generic elements of D&D's system? The movie's setting is definitely the D&D world. I don't remember if they say Forgotten Realms or Faerun in the movie, but there's not really anything in it that's memorable. And as for the magic system, well, they basically completely ignore it in the movie. The Bard and the Druid don't really seem to be able to cast that many spells, relying on their class's other core features of inspiration and wild shape. And the Sorcerer's core conflict is that he has a mental block that prevents him from casting spells for most of the movie. Only the villain uses magic with the same frequency and potency of any regular D&D spellcasting character. This fits with a softer approach to magic, in which the characters and audience's fractional understanding adds to the magic's awesome power, without the characters using it to solve problems. To be clear, I think this was a good choice. The party, which feels like it's supposed to be at, 8th or 9th level, would seem completely overpowered and unstoppable if they could actually cast Wall of Fire and Synaptic Static and Haste multiple times per combat. We don't have the time to learn the limitations of these abilities, so it would just look like a wizard did it, and suck all the tension out of fight scenes. If you actually adapt D&D's magic rules into a book or movie, it would have to be either wildly dull or horribly confusing to directly represent the tension created by the management of spell slots over the course of an adventuring day. This tension works great in an interactive medium where the player is responsible for managing these resources themselves. But how much time are you going to make a reader or audience member spend paying attention to how many spell slots of how many different levels each character has over the course of a fight? For that matter, do spell slots even represent something in universe? Or is it just a game abstraction, like intelligence, wisdom, and charisma scores, that characters surely don't actually have or know about in world? The magic system is clearly designed to fit inside a game system, not a fixed narrative one. But because of the requirements of the game, D&D suffers from a version of the IP video game effect, where in an effort to make gameplay more dynamic and rich, the designers add so many different powers and abilities that the power scaling totally breaks away from the source material. Star Wars has certainly suffered this fate.
I know more about the Force than most people because Dave Filoni taught me and George Lucas taught him. And all these video games have fucked people up on what the Force is. Like, you don't get to level up in the Star Wars world. That's a fucking video game.
I would argue the Insomniac Spider-Man games created a similar effect, giving Spider-Man all sorts of gadgets and web powers that fit fine in a video game, but would seem completely ridiculous if you put them in a comic or movie. D&D's spell system, like Starkiller's insane force powers in The Force Unleashed, are not suited to representation in non-interactive linear media. Ironically, the only thing that's consistent about D&D's world across playgroups, the magic system, is the first thing you have to jettison in an adaptation. When we look at successful narrative media based on D&D, the best example probably ever is Baldur's Gate 3, which I don't need to remind you was named the 2023 Game of the Year at the Game Awards. It doesn't have any of those problems adapting an interactive medium into a fixed one because it's also interactive. It doesn't capture the improvisational comedic tone of many modern D&D campaigns, but it doesn't have to. The spell system is right at home. The Forgotten Realms lore that most D&D players just ignore can actually be serviced, immersing the player in the conflict between the Githyanki and the Illithids, the Infernal Plane, and the histories of the gods Shar and Mystra. And the writers created a suite of wonderful companions with compelling stories who are the equivalent of other PCs in a tabletop campaign. This now beloved story is surely good for D&D's brand, although I can't help but think that it's better for Baldur's Gate's brand than D&D's, and for Larian Studios than for Wizards of the Coast. In February 2024, just 6 months after the game's release, Larian announced that they don't plan on working with Hasbro again. This is no doubt related to the wave of mass layoffs Hasbro conducted earlier this year, affecting many of the people responsible for bringing Baldur's Gate 3 into existence from the Hasbro side. In his talk at the Game Developers Conference in March, Larian Studios founder and Baldur's Gate 3 director Sven Vinke said that, "Greed has been fucking this whole thing up for so long, since I started. It's always the quarterly profits. The only thing that matters are the numbers. And then you fire everybody, and the next year you say, shit, I'm out of developers. And then you start hiring people again. And then you do acquisitions, and then you put them in the same loop again. So while Wizards will certainly seek a developer for Baldur's Gate 4, it's doubtful they can achieve the same heights reached by Larian." Just this year, D&D also partnered with LEGO to release a large playset and a series of blind bag minifigures, many of which are on the shelf behind me. This is a landmark collaboration between Hasbro and its chief competitor. It's also partnered with LEGO to make 2 Transformers sets, and I wouldn't be surprised if this partnership expands further. After years of trying to compete with LEGO at their own game, with Built to Rule and then Creo, Hasbro finally took a page out of Yosemite Sam's book.
If you can't beat 'em, join 'em.
This is an interesting one because it's a system brand collaborating with another system brand. The Red Dragon's Tale set from April of this year comes with a D&D adventure that you can theoretically play using the minifigures and built components from the set. The Blind Bag minifigure line features a few iconic villains from popular D&D adventures. Although I have to admit I only knew who a couple of them were, even as a variant franchised player, and a lineup of unnamed adventurers representing the range of classes and races you can pick from when you play D&D. Each of these characters comes with a male and female head, allowing you to represent adventurers of any race, class, and gender expression if you swap the heads around. The implication seems to be that you could actually use these minifigures as minis in your campaign, a system synergy that many players, including myself, have already been deploying for years. So this partnership is different from the others, in that it isn't about creating a specific story out of D&D's generic one. Quite the opposite. It's about providing you with the generic game pieces to create whatever story you want. This is something D&D and LEGO naturally have in common, and a reason this is already a successful partnership. And finally, though this isn't the direct result of a strategy decision by Hasbro or WotC, I think it's worth noting that the generic nature of D&D does lend itself to generic references to high magic fantasy in the culture. The technical distinctions among different kinds of magic users, wizards, warlocks, and sorcerers, which all basically meant the same thing until D&D made up the differences, are now part of the common parlance for IP-agnostic discussions of magic online. Most of the memes in r/wizard posting are, implicitly or explicitly, based on D&D.
Goblins will see you teleport and say, he can't afford a steed. Wizards will see you sneak through the Valley of Shadows and say, he hath not the arcane might to cast invisibility.
Warlocks be like, my lord Asmodeus has forsaken my soul and doomed me to eternal suffering in the pits of Infernus. My brother in the arcane arts, you're the one who signed an eldritch pact with an archfiend.
Okay, admittedly the last one was an original, but I think the point stands. D&D is passively generating brand love because of how generic and broad it is, even from people who have never played it. Every time a wizard meme goes viral, like Shadow Wizard Money Gang,
Shadow Wizard Money Gang, we love casting spells,
or Real Wizards FM,
you're listening to 102.3.
It subtly expands D&D's reach in the culture and theoretically improves its returns to marginal affinity. D&D's alignment chart has also achieved wide cultural penetration, following the proliferation of alignment chart memes in the late 2010s and early 2020s. I doubt most people who traffic these memes knew the chart originated in D&D. Multiple times I've had a friend suggest that we all place ourselves on the alignment chart, only to be completely surprised when I tell them where it comes from. I actually suspect that alignment chart memes are a major contributing factor to the expanded use of chaotic in Gen Z slang to mean quirky, fun, and adventurous. But there are more qualified people than myself who can investigate that further. Regardless, this cultural knowledge of the alignment chart produces its own marginal affinity for the D&D brand. I've run games for several new players who knew the alignment chart but didn't know it was from D&D, and got especially excited at the prospect of picking an alignment for their character. There are certainly more D&D brand partnerships in different media that I could talk about in detail, but I think I've covered enough to show the range. The question is, why is D&D expanding in this direction? If their stories aren't compelling enough to be represented in other media, why create these new system crossovers with their own original stories? The answer lies in the economics. Remember, D&D is right on the border of club good and public good. It makes an order of magnitude less money than Magic, only $100 to $200 million a year. So even if they did more crossover partnerships into the D&D system, it just wouldn't make them that much money. The D&D movie wasn't a smash hit, but obviously Hasbro was interested in at least trying to build some story love with the generic resources at their disposal. After the film's mixed success and Hasbro's selling of E1, it's unlikely they'll repeat this soon. But the film grossed $208 million on a $150 million budget, and Hasbro must have figured that even a low 10 millions profit would mark strong growth for D&D's total revenue. If I were writing a D&D movie, and I'd certainly love to, I would take a page out of the Lego Movies book and make it as much about the playing of the game as the story told within it. Cast a bunch of actors to play both real-life nerds and the superheroic paladins and sorcerers in their secondary world. Show us how role-playing allows people to come out of their shelves and express or discover new things about themselves that they couldn't before. Show us how the tensions and struggles of the secondary world play back into the teenage drama of the primary one. Let's see some theater kids fall in love at the D&D table while their characters fall in love on the battlefield. Let's see an auteur DM come to accept that his perfect creation is just one piece of a collaborative story. Let's see a found family of outcasts come of age together in the mundane and fantasy worlds at the same time. I'm sure I'm not the first to suggest this, and I honestly bet someone at Hasbro has already heard a pitch or two to this effect. But if you want to build brand love, it wouldn't hurt to start by remembering that the system is the story. What about the other media expansions? It's hard to tell the exact yearly totals, but Baldur's Gate has reportedly grossed nearly $2 billion since its release in August 2023. It's unknown what WotC's exact royalties deal is with Larian, but in February of this year, Hasbro announced on an investor call that Hasbro's take had reached $90 million in the game's first 6 months. In its first year, it's not impossible that Baldur's Gate 3 made more for Hasbro than all of the rest of D&D combined. Video games are a slam dunk expansion for D&D because they actually are excludable, meaning they can actually charge for entry, and they have enough system similarities that the adaptation can still capitalize on the strengths of D&D's generic system. D&D has already partnered with Destiny 2, Dead by Daylight, and Minecraft to release DLC adventures featuring D&D elements, and it's apparently planning to do more. As for the LEGO partnership, Hasbro already sells all sorts of D&D minis, but it's just hard for them to compete effectively with third-party manufacturers, especially after the proliferation of 3D resin printing. Why not join in with a system that has market power and take a cut of the profits? And what about the future? We know that following the acquisition of D&D Beyond, Wizards is planning to launch a new virtual tabletop that they demoed for the first time at Gen Con in August. When we understand the economics, the reason is obvious. This is a different system with different economic features that WotC can leverage D&D's existing brand love to sell. A virtual tabletop is a true club good that they can charge a subscription fee for with 100% excludability. And like the most profitable club goods, they can charge for microtransactions once inside to monetize every element of the game. Races, classes, maps, magic items, monsters, special dice, anything you can think of. I have to be honest, I would love it if there was one platform where I could cleanly handle everything I need to play D&D virtually with great UI and UX. Right now when I play virtually, my campaign calls on Discord, keeps character sheets in D&D Beyond, and uses battle maps on Roll20. This is not exactly a smooth experience. I know zealots and shills will go to the comments to tell me that I can video call and store character info on Roll22, or that I should be using Foundry or something else. But there are reasons I don't like Roll20's systems for those other features, and don't think I'll like whatever other VTT is out there either. I don't even really like Roll20 that much for battle maps. It's just the best one I've found. If Hasbro can pull this new VTT off, and that is a big if, I'd be happy to switch to just one platform that does everything smoothly. Frankly, it's ridiculous we still haven't gotten one when Wizards was planning their never-materialized 4th edition VTT 16 years ago in 2008. There's been speculation that the new VTT might have loot crate elements, making certain magic items or dungeon maps or class and ancestry traits accessible only inside randomly generated mystery boxes that you have to buy with real money. If players buy into the new VTT system enough that it generates market power over existing ones and creates a strong brand of its own, then this really could move D&D toward Magic, and Fortnite and Overwatch and FIFA for that matter, from a monetization perspective. But I find this unlikely. Again, we must consider the basic economic characteristics of D&D as a good. Ultimately, unlike a video game, you do not play an RPG virtually, even if you're using a high-fidelity virtual tabletop with fancy graphics. You play it in your mind and in conversation with the other players. The tabletop is there to help you keep track of information and perhaps scaffold the experience aesthetically. But that's it. If the new VTT requires a DM to buy a loot crate to have a chance of getting the Sword of Kos, but you're a DM who wants to give that sword to a player anyway, you'll just flip the bird to WotC and go use one of the many free tabletops available online. And if they take those away too, You can always go back to haphazardly balancing your phone on a water bottle so that the camera overlooks a sheet of graph paper with a bunch of meeples on it, as I've done several times in my own campaigns. For the longer term, this is what I predict for D&D. As has always been the case, people will continue playing whatever edition they started the game on. Because once you get one set of rules, you never have to give WotC your money again, most people will stick to the rules they know and already own. And the new rules will be of relevance principally to new players and the people who just like arguing about rules online for some reason. If the new VTT is good, some people will probably switch to the new rules just to play with it. Brand crossovers into non-interactive, fixed media will continue to flounder, while crossovers with interactive and especially fully unbounded creative systems will succeed. But in the long run, D&D will never be able to make $1 billion a year selling rules that you can mostly look up online for free or make up yourself. Okay, now let's talk about Magic. Magic is a generic system like D&D, which makes it unattractive for story adaptations into other media, and especially fixed media. But it's a fully private good, which means if it uses its system power to pull in resonant stories from other places, it should be able to monetize them extremely effectively. Magic has flirted with telling its stories in other systems many times. Some version of a Magic TV show or movie has been trapped in development hell since 2001. None have yet materialized, although reportedly production is going forward on an animated show at Netflix. It's possible they could pull off an Arcane, but Jace Beleren just doesn't have the brand power he needs to sell a show on its own. But much more impactful than any of those false starts is Magic's recent expansion into telling other stories in its own system. That's right, you've waited long enough. It's finally time to talk about Universes Beyond. Magic's most impactful brand strategy decision of the past decade, and possibly ever, was the introduction of Universes Beyond products, in which the Magic system is used to create cards and sets based on non-Magic characters and stories. Some of these are matches made in heaven, a great story with a strong brand, hungry for more perfect systems in which to express itself. The 2023 draftable direct-to-modern expansion Lord of the Rings Tales from Middle-earth was an absolute home run. Big surprise that Magic's general fantasy sensibility fits perfectly with modern fantasy's genre-defining story. Tales from Middle-earth is also one of the most flavorful sets ever, with design after slam dunk design, and quickly became the best-selling Magic set of all time. Some Universes Beyond products are clunkier fits, like The Walking Dead and Fallout, discordant with the planes of Magic's multiverse in genre and aesthetic. It's worth noting that since the introduction of Universes Beyond, Magic has expanded the generic and aesthetic scope of its own planes and expansions, introducing future science fiction elements on planes like Kamigawa, and deploying distinctly 20th century aesthetics for the first time in sets like the 1920s New York-inspired New Capenna and screen horror Duskmourn. I'm sure these sets reflect an earnest aspiration to broader generic scope on the part of the Magic design and story teams, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the expansion has coincided with the proliferation of Universes Beyond. Perhaps the furthest generic departure for Magic is upcoming, with the draftable Spider-Man expansion releasing next year. Not only is it Magic's first superhero set, a genre it's hard to imagine them adopting to a core Magic plane in the same way as science fiction, but we can expect that it'll take place largely in recognizable 21st century New York City. It won't be the first set to reference real-world locations or people. Doctor Who, Assassin's Creed, and to some extent Fallout have already done this, but it will reach a new extreme of generic and aesthetic dissonance, especially if they choose to represent recognizable actors from Spider-Man movies in the set's art. Since the advent of Universes Beyond, many Magic the Gathering players have decried it for diluting Magic's identity and breaking immersion. One of the loudest voices critical of Universes Beyond is the professor from Tolarian Community College.
This breaks my heart because half of Magic the Gathering isn't Magic the Gathering anymore. It feels as if the world of Magic is disappearing, as if the game of Magic the Gathering isn't even Magic the Gathering anymore, but rather a game that is a collection of pop culture advertisements for other properties.
The meme that best represents this idea is the now infamous 2021 cardboard crack comic that depicts a future state of Magic where SpongeBob, Iron Man, and a Whopper are battling Kylo Ren, Elsa from Frozen, and Travis Scott. This particular future hasn't come to pass yet, but in 2024 you can play a game of Commander where Optimus Prime and the 10th Doctor driving the Ecto-1 fight a Space Marine and Hatsune Miku in a Fortnite battle bus. Okay, Time to put my cards on the table. I never really understood the objection to Universes Beyond. Magic, as we've established, is a generic game. Why not let the cards literally represent the fantasies, like Lord of the Rings, that have shaped the generic space Magic draws upon? Magic already draws on existing tropes to create resonance with top-down designs. In brand terms, Magic has the power to leverage existing public domain cultural brands, like zombies, like Arthurian legend, like the 1001 Nights, within its unique system. Fans of those brands will be happy to come experience the story tropes they love in a new medium, and fans of the system will be happy to see something specific and resonant represented in it. Remember, Magic has been doing the same thing since the very beginning. In a certain sense, Arabian Nights was Magic's very first Universes Beyond set, released just 4 months after the game debuted.
You know, one of the reasons why I've got some hesitation for condemning it, back in the day, my first expansion was Arabian Nights. And there is this question as to whether Arabian Nights should have been part of the Magic world proper. I didn't mind exploring other mythologies and literatures and so forth and making a coherent experience with those. And I wouldn't have minded if Magic had dedicated themselves to that approach.
Most of Magic's strongest sets from a lore and flavor perspective are direct adaptations of existing fantasy subgenres or settings in the public domain. Why not do the same thing for settings owned by other companies? Personally, I don't see any in-principle difference from a gameplay or system perspective between referencing modern myths like vampires, owned by no one, and modern myths like Batman, owned by a certain corporation. If Magic has any core lore that distinguishes it from other fantasy worlds, it's that there are planeswalkers who have the ability to travel between worlds with different magics, conflicts, and aesthetics. This lore conceit allows the game to reinvent itself thematically and narratively every few months, when it jumps to a new plane that represents a new story within the Magic multiverse. Planeswalkers are the only card type that Wizards has said they have no plans to put in a Universes Beyond product, because while the story objects represented by creature, artifact, and enchantment cards exist in most other story worlds, Planeswalkers are something unique to Magic. The heart of the Magic universe's identity is that it can travel to infinite different planes with infinite different tropes and conflicts represented thereon. When the professor tries to articulate what gives the planes of Magic's multiverse a unique identity in Magic the Gathering Moves Universes Beyond, this is what he has to say.
The squirrel, Emrakul, the magical lightning greaves. They are all from Magic the Gathering worlds that share the same constant of being Magic the Gathering worlds. Whether on Innistrad or Ravnica or Tarkir, the flavors of these worlds may change from horror to magical city to dragons, but they are still within the larger construct of the Magic the Gathering game and world.
I don't think it speaks highly of Magic's story identity that even the staunchest defender of the game's purity from Universes Beyond can't name any characteristics that distinguish Magic's worlds other than that they're all Magic. Now, I know there are players who are invested in Magic specifically for its particular lore. They're called Vorthos, to go with the original 3 Magic psychographics of Timmy, Tammy, Johnny, Jenny, and Spike, who play the game for exciting gameplay experiences, clever deck-building designs, and competitive achievement, respectively. But just the fact that there's a special subcategory of players who like Magic for the story shows you that this is different from other brands. What else would a Star Wars fan be than someone who likes Star Wars for its story, characters, and lore? To me, the resistance to Universes Beyond looks like an unusual form of brand loyalty. It's like the converse of people celebrating the Disney Fox acquisition simply because the Marvel characters previously owned by Fox were coming home to Marvel Studios. What's the difference between Magic making a series of dark fantasy space opera commander decks set on an original plane and Magic making a series of Warhammer 40k commander decks? I don't think there is one, except that the Space Marines fighting Necrons is a lot more resonant than, Galactic Legionnaires fighting Mortons. I don't even play Warhammer or have any particular investment in the franchise, but I thought the 40k decks were sick. If the resonant trope space Magic wants to play in is in the public domain, they should feel free to adapt it to their own multiverse. But if it's owned by another company, then yeah, they should absolutely collaborate to represent those stories in Magic's amazing game system. I can understand better a larger objection to Magic's increased generic expansiveness in recent years, which is most visible in Universes Beyond sets with a strong generic departure from Magic's past, but exists across its whole line of products.
even within Magic the Gathering's premise of the multiverse, there's a larger binding aesthetic that makes this game distinct. Not just a fantasy aesthetic, but Magic the Gathering's specific fantasy aesthetic. Things it does and things it does not do.
As we know, Magic's greatest strength on a story level is its generic qualities. When you tamper with this, by going sci-fi or Western or anything 20th century, you risk disrupting what people already love about the game. But I think the expansion from pure fantasy to a broader range of speculative fiction genres was inevitable, and actually really healthy for the game in the long run. Once again, let's look to Mark Rosewater's The Big Picture article. The game's lifeblood, its essence, is tied to the fact that it's constantly iterating on itself. I honestly believe if we stopped innovating, if we stopped pushing boundaries and exploring what Magic can be, it would die. Magic has survived this long by exploring more and more trope space within the fantasy genre. But it's been 30 years. In order for it to keep iterating on itself, it now has to expand further. One objection I've heard to Universes Beyond is that it's basically just Magic selling ad space to these other mega corporations so Daddy Hasbro can pay the bills. I guess I can relate to the desire not to see the game you love commoditized and productized to the nth degree, ceasing to be anything other than an advertisement for something else. Sam Gaglio, better known as the Magic video essayist Ristic Studies, compares Magic's new direction to the business model of Funko Pop in his recent Substack essay, Your Foundation is Rotten. He writes, "What is the function of a Funko Pop if not to perpetuate the relevance of other multimedia icons? What does a Funko Pop of a Funko Pop look like? The company does not have a mascot or a message. It just sells a mold, a silhouette, the outline of a knickknack." Many have compared Universes Beyond, and especially the cards that are just reskins of existing cards, to Fortnite skins, arguing that Magic ought not just become a new monetized system for every other media company to sell a superficial experience of their characters and stories. It's no small irony in these critics' view that Fortnite is among the Universes Beyond themes that have given the reskin treatment to a suite of Secret Lair cards. I think these arguments misunderstand what makes Universes Beyond resonant and compelling. Yes, the reskin treatments are fun and sentimental in small doses in Secret Lairs. But if Universes Beyond was just a few drops of a few reskin cards a year, there wouldn't be such widespread criticism of Universes Beyond in the first place. It would just feel like another premium option that some players will buy to bling out their deck with special promo versions of a few cards. The more prominent and controversial iteration of Universes Beyond is the full sets of originally designed external IP cards. These crossovers are certainly great ways to sell fans of other nerdy properties on Magic and get them hooked on the game. I have a friend who's a huge Warhammer fan who had tried Magic a few times but never really taken to it. After I got him one of the Warhammer decks for his birthday, he totally embraced the game, and now asks me to play every time I see him. But these cards are not simply slapping a Warhammer or Fallout or Assassin's Creed logo on a booster box to make it sell better. These are fully designed sets that strive to capture the story elements of these franchises within Magic's system. Building cards based on known characters and worlds can make a new player more interested, but more importantly, it makes it easier to learn how to play the game. Here's Jason Alt, Corbin Hostler, DJ Johnson, and Ryan Bouchard discussing this idea on the Brainstorm Brewery podcast.
It strips a layer of what you don't understand away from the game, right? You're learning the rules of Magic, but you don't have to learn Magic's IP too.
And it turns out, by the way,
there's not much worth learning.
When cards work the way you would expect them to work in a Universes Beyond.
River Song, that card is very, very thematically appropriate. Yes. I showed that to a Doctor Who watcher who is not a Magic player. They've never touched Magic or a card game, and they're like, oh, that makes so much sense.
If you go back to what Wizards always called their strongest designs historically, a lot about top-down design, right? Innistrad hits on all the tropes you expect out of that kind of world. They credited that concept a lot for its success. So it does extend to Universes Beyond. River Song working the way you expect. That's an incredible moment that ties the two together in a way that doesn't exist if it's, a random rocks from Alara.
Resonant top-down designs don't just sell the set, they help you understand how to play the game. This is the same resource that Richard Garfield used when he drew inspiration from D&D and his design of Alpha. Calling the card Fireball isn't just useful because it makes you go, oh, cool, a fireball, like from D&D. It's useful because if you don't understand the rules of Magic yet, and you just read the card text, which says, Fireball does X damage total divided evenly rounded down among any number of targets. Pay 1 extra mana for each target beyond the first. You might be kind of confused, but when you understand that this represents a magical fireball exploding and hitting several enemies, it's easier to make sense of that text. And drawing on resonant source material helps not just with understanding a card that's already written, but with designing a card in the first place. In response to a Blogatog question critical of Universes Beyond following the announcement of 2025's release schedule, Mark Rosewater writes that Universes Beyond has been a bolt of energy for the design of the game. It has inspired us to make fresh new designs. It has sparked creativity. We are making awesome card designs, mechanics, themes, and sets, things that most likely wouldn't have come into existence otherwise. Remember, Magic is a hungry shark that has to keep swimming and eating to survive. Magic's stories are already designed to capture the resonant elements of fantasy tropes. This doesn't just work because it makes you go, oh cool, a werewolf. It works because when the designer starts by saying, I'm going to make a werewolf, the card that comes out of it is designed better. This actually makes the game more fun. That's because the mechanics the designers come up with no longer just exist in a vacuum. They exist in relation to the story elements that the mechanics no longer have to convey all by themselves. Rosewater doesn't say that Magic design has been struggling to generate fresh ideas recently. I doubt he would say that even if it were true. But it's not surprising that after 30 years of digging further and further for iconic fantasy tropes and concise game mechanics to match them, getting a fresh wave of beloved stories and characters with which to design resonant cards would be a bolt of energy to the design team. Rosewater concludes that the passion that beloved characters and worlds has inspired in us is translated into amazing Magic design, something that will make the act of playing Magic better for anyone who enjoys the nuts and bolts of the raw gameplay of Magic. Instead of thinking of Magic as becoming Funko Pop or Fortnite, I think it's more appropriate to think of it as becoming more like Lego. Yes, there was controversy around LEGO expanding to licensed themes with Star Wars in 1999. Many within the company felt it was diluting LEGO's own brand, and surely many fans of LEGO's existing themes and cohesive brand felt that it was a soulless cash grab. Former LEGO head of operations in the Americas, Peter Io, recounted to Fast Company magazine in 2001 that when he brought the idea of partnering with Star Wars to the board in 1998, their initial reaction was, "You guys are crazy. We had been such a purist company. We tended to want to do everything within ourselves." Io recalls that one board member even told him, "Over my dead body will you be launching Star Wars in Europe?" But when the product line was a success, they realized the power of using LEGO to build an already resonant story. Says Io, "It led us to say, storytelling is important. In the long run, it's clear that this expansion was good for LEGO and for LEGO fans. Yes, the most popular LEGO themes are no longer story properties owned by LEGO. This change certainly diluted LEGO's own story identity, but it arguably strengthened its system identity. LEGO no longer represented only the generic settings of city, space, castle, and pirates, or even the original settings of Adventurers and Blacktron. It was able to flex its system muscles in representing X-Wings and pod racers. It expanded our understanding of what the LEGO system could do, what this medium could represent. By the time of the LEGO movie 15 years later, this franchise and universe-spanning swirl of endless representations had come to define the brand even more than the broad, "these simple bricks can be anything you imagine" perspective that the LEGO brand started with. When you're a kid, who cares which character is owned by which corporation? It's just fun to play with them all together. Something was certainly lost in LEGO's identity in this transition. I don't want to diminish that, but I think it's clear much more was gained. Is it crazy to think that this is what's in store for Magic? In my view, this is a future to look forward to, not one to lament. It's possible to imagine a LEGO fan in 1999 having the same thought as that infamous cardboard crack comic. Pretty soon, LEGO is going to be Batman flying the Millennium Falcon into Mount Doom. It would have seemed almost parodic at the time, and eventually they would have been right, just like the cardboard crack comic. But what seemed unthinkable to the LEGO board in 1999 was a healthy foundation of their brand strategy a decade later. There's a whole world of wonderful stories and characters out there seeking the chance to find perfect, resonant representation on a Magic card. As Magic expands further into new genres and settings, in its own worlds and beyond, the game keeps growing and iterating and finding new life.
Kiss me once before thou goest, summertide sorrow.
Basically, every brand decision Wizards of the Coast makes with Magic and D&D is extremely controversial. But when you understand these games both as media systems and as economic goods, these decisions make a lot more sense. What's more, you can understand why some succeed while others fail, and predict how future decisions will turn out. Magic the Gathering and Dungeons & Dragons are generic game systems. This is not a bad thing. It's what has made them successful. It's allowed them to permeate so many different areas of fantasy and speculative fiction, and in some ways define the superset of the genre that they sought to represent. This broadness allows the games to be continuously reinvented by players and designers, always growing, always evolving. Hasbro is going to do with these games what they think will keep making the line go up and to the right. But ultimately, they're beholden to the generic nature of the systems they sell, and the excludability and rivalrousness of those systems as goods. D&D isn't likely to pull in outside IP to the degree Magic has, simply because D&D system is hard to monetize effectively. But if the new VTT is a success, maybe we could see WotC selling special digital-only monsters from other franchises. It's more likely that D&D will continue trying to create resonant stories in other media, not because it's particularly promising in an absolute sense, but because even modest success offers way more money than just selling more versions of rulebooks and adventures. Magic's success with Universes Beyond is not simply driven by cynical franchisation and hapless consumers clamoring to buy one more thing with an image of their favorite character on it. I understand the frustration that comes with a system you love reinventing itself past what made you fall in love with it. But in the long run, it's not hard to see Universes Beyond as great for Magic's story resonance, system love, and bottom line. Win, win, win. It was always silly for Magic to try to leverage its obscure stories to build a resonant brand. It makes much more sense from a business and game design perspective to leverage its incredible system to tell more and more resonant stories. Dungeons & Dragons and Magic the Gathering did not rise from nerd culture obscurity to being the flagship brands of one of the world's largest toy companies by accident, and they're only going to grow from here by embracing their unique strengths as systems and goods. Okay, we done? All right.
I see a red door and I want it painted black. No colors anymore, I want them to turn black.
D&D is a generic system, which means it lacks the story resonance necessary to sexfully, Jesus. I wish D&D could sexfully monetize.